With the War Within expansion right around the corner, I see people asking all the time, what is the best class? So in today's video, I've done my best to try and answer it. Here are the top 3 classes in the War Within right now, in my opinion. Before we dive in, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to catch all of my future War Within content. The third best class to play is the Death Knight, another class that seems to have done really well out of a class rework. This class is dominating right now and covers all bases, whether it's tanking, single target damage, or being a mass AoE monster. In the class tree and even generally, they have made multiple abilities baseline for the DK, alongside reducing some 2-point talent nodes to only cost 1 point. This frees up a plethora of points to be spent elsewhere for the Death Knight, for example, grabbing Wraith Walk or even picking up insane utility points like Vestigial Shell to grant anti-magic shell to 2 nearby allies. Regardless of spec, the Death Knight is an incredibly tanky class with multiple damage reduction passives, multiple defensives in Lichborn, Icebound Fortitude, the already mentioned anti-magic shell, and even Death Strike to heal up your recent damage intake. The Blood Death Knight has been absolutely blessed coming into the new expansion, is probably the best feeling tank right now, and if I was to main a tank, it would almost certainly be this one. We are finally back to picking up Gorfiend's Grasp, a long forgotten iconic ability that pulls all enemies to your target's location, but now also silences them for 3 seconds. There was a reason that the Vengeance Demon Hunter was so dominant during Dragonflight, and now the Blood Death Knight is going to be close to that level. Gorfiend's Grasp plus Abomination Limb and 2 Death Grip charges gives this spec control over mobs like no other tank in the game. They also got a rework to their Bone Storm ability, making it much more valuable as a pickup. Bone Storm now costs Bone Shield charges instead of Runic Power, and this has some crazy synergies. Through talents like Shattering Bone, exploding all consumed Bone Shield charges, the Blood DK can now put out some incredible DPS in AoE encounters every 1 minute, while still having access to all of their Runic Power to dump into Death Strikes that so famously keeps this spec completely self-sustaining. So if you like being in complete control of your own health pool, spiking yourself back up to full HP with the press of 1 Death Strike, then the Blood DK may be for you. Blood and Frost can become a Deathbringer to apply a Reaper's Mark to their target that explodes and empowers your next Obliterate or Marrow Rend to also exterminate your targets with a gigantic scythe for crazy high damage. Proccing these scythes back to back looks so sick and makes you feel like you are an actual bringer of death. So that's the tank side of the class covered, now let's move on to the DPS. Frost Death Knight also got a rework, reducing many 2-point nodes into 1 that again frees up points to spend on their newly positioned Empowered Rune weapon, keeping Frost access to a larger but longer cooldown. Frost is a relatively simple spec, still playing very much the same going into the War Within. You'll be mashing buttons that light up like Obliterate for insane on-demand damage, especially when combined with the Death and Decay that cleaves this onto multiple targets. And they also seem to be leaning heavily into an auto-attack playstyle with their new talents, keeping the simplicity of the spec and increasing the value of a dual-wield build to generate even more runic power. This extra runic power can be dumped with Frost Strike to consume Razor Ice stacks on the target to deal extra damage and even explode them with Shattered Frost, allowing for better players to express their skill with great AoE potential. Or perhaps with all of this extra runic power, we'll even see the return of Breath of Sindragosa, but with an easier upkeep as you'll be swimming in resources. Frost seems to have a lot of build variants going into this next expansion, allowing them to try different builds for different situations, which is going to be super fun and keep the spec feeling fresh. Frost and Unholy can become a Rider of the Apocalypse that are joined by the 4 Horsemen throughout their rotation, each of them granting you a different buff. The most engaging buff you gain is undoubtedly the Death and Decay Mograine provides you, allowing you to cleave your heavy hitters more frequently. Another big win for this hero talent is being able to mount your Death Charger in combat. Believe me, this alone is worth the pickup, but you can also do this permanently in the outdoor world. And then we come to the Unholy Death Knight, possibly my favourite of the specs after the rework, and that is saying a lot as I was never too much of a fan of this spec in previous expansions. Unholy is absolutely pumping on the beta right now. It doesn't matter what encounter you find yourself in, because you will find yourself at the top of the meters. Unholy has multiple different builds, whether you're summoning a Gargoyle to deal incredible single target damage, spamming Epidemic for unmatched mass AoE damage, or even covering everything in between by cleaving Death Coils, is probably the best melee spec in the game right now. This is also thanks to the spec being much quicker to ramp and therefore being much more bursty. With the conversion of Unholy Blight into a passive, this means your Dark Transformation also applies your diseases, so your opener flows a lot more smoothly than before. Your new Abomination will also apply diseases and festering wounds that you can pile on even more of with your new Festering Scythe talent, converting your Festering Strike into a scythe that cleaves for huge damage while also applying multiple wounds to all targets. This is probably my favourite addition to the spec. Not only does it put out great numbers, if you want to feel like a true necromancer summoning ghouls, abominations, maguses and more while spreading your diseases and bursting wounds, then this is the spec for you. Not to mention, you can also now summon the 4 horsemen to fight by your side. This spec is definitely going to be a favourite. Unholy and Blood can turn Sand Lane, replacing their Scourge or Heart Strike with Vampiric Strike. This strike not only sounds perfect, but it will more importantly grant you extra haste, as well as extending or even consuming your main disease on the target for great single target burst. They also fittingly summon a Blood Beast that perfectly matches the fantasy of the spec by exploding for AoE damage and healing once it expires. The next best class in the War Within so far is the Evoker. Coming into Dragonflight, this class was also a great pickup. New classes normally perform really well on their introduction, and it also brought new gameplay mechanics to the game with their empowered spells, interacting differently the longer you hold your ability, which makes for some really fun decision making. This class remains a great pick heading into the War Within. It has had some minor changes, mainly cleaning up or moving a few talent points in the specs, and you can now even skyride in your Saw mode. How sick is that? Evokers have crazy high mobility to make up for their shorter range, and boast unmatched utility with AoE knockups, knockbacks, stuns, damage reduction for your party, and you can even rescue a friend out of certain death. And then came along 10.1.5, the introduction of the most broken spec in the game since its arrival, the Augmentation Evoker. And if you can't beat them, join them. This new spec is the king of utility, being the only support style class in the game. Aug Evokers buff their allies with secondary stats, and most importantly buff their party's main stat with the Ebb and Might buff, playing a little mini game of extending this buff duration for as long as they can to maximize their group's throughput. Breath of Eons plays a big part in this too, by coordinating this breath with your party's cooldown to contribute massively to their damage. Being the only support spec means that when Aug is good, it's great. And to add to this, thanks to the new hero talents, Aug is also pumping out more DPS than ever. With all of their contributed damage added to their own damage, they are easily the most broken spec right now. They can literally do it all. Buff teammates' throughput, buff their survivability by granting extra versatility and absorb shields, completely control mobs with passive knockups and stuns through their rotation, and they even boast a cheat death. The spec isn't even too complicated either. You'll definitely notice a good Aug from a newer one, but the rotation is pretty simple, and once you get into the mindset of playing around your team, you'll be playing a massive role in your group's success. So if you enjoy a completely unique playstyle of supporting your team offensively and defensively to see success, then this spec could be yours. Augmentation and Devastation can choose to be scale commanders, a super fun idea that makes your Eruption or Disintegrate cleave on up to 3 targets after using an empowered ability. Mass Disintegrate looks sick, and that alone is why this is one of my favorite hero talents right now. They also call their Drakthir army to bombard their targets with bombs, which is visually so satisfying, and they can even control the direction of their deep breath. Just remember, you can press your keybind again to stop yourself before you make a mistake. Next up, we have the Devastation Evoker, which unfortunately, since Aug's arrival, has been pretty much overshadowed, even while it was still good. But it's now even better going into the War Within. Dev is one of the burstiest specs in the game. Not many can keep up with it off the rip due to their explosive Dragon Rage cooldown and hard-hitting empowered abilities. The spec has found itself in a much more fun position than it originally was, with constant cooldown reduction on your empowered abilities that can then increase the duration of your main cooldown. It all plays into each other really nicely. But the majority of my fun on this spec comes from Firestorm, which finally seems to be viable. Casting this ability and then getting free instant uses of it, as well as Pyre proccing free ones, is so cool, just being able to bombard your targets with cinders. I've managed to get 4 out at one time, and let me tell you, nobody was even close to the damage that I was putting out. The AoE damage from this spec is crazy high, and when talented into a more single target build that fires out Eternity Surges during your disintegrates, the boss damage does not disappoint either. So if you enjoy an incredibly bursty playstyle that is relatively simple to execute, the Devastation Evoker will fit your needs. Devastation and Preservation can turn into a Flame Shaper, gaining access to Engulf, an instant hard-hitting ability that increases in throughput for each periodic effect on the target. This then also explodes your Fire or Dream Breath for extra damage or healing to deal amazing throughput and AoE cleave around the target. This makes this ability super potent regardless of if it's single target or AoE. What's interesting about Engulf is Preservation can make active decisions whether they want to use it defensively or offensively, dependent on what the fight needs. And that brings us onto the healing side of the Evoker, Preservation. This spec is looking really strong coming into the War Within, and from the healers that I've asked, it seems like it's one of the most engaging. The big win for this spec though is the fact that Blizzard have baked some of the tier sets from Dragonflight into the talent or hero talent tree. Something I wish they'd do more of. New capstones like Lifespark are great additions and something that all Preservation Evokers missed when it was stripped from them. This gives the Evoker instant buff Living Flames that can also cleave with Leaping Flames, and again, this also allows you to choose to use it offensively or defensively, which I think is an amazing mechanic for healers to play around. Because of where this new capstone is, there is now a new red build straight down the middle, and then we have the bronze on the right and green on the left still. This is amazing. The amount of build variance with this spec keeps it always feeling new, and you have so many different options dependent on the type of content you are clearing. You could focus on green and do tons of Dream Breath healing, or you could even play a bronze build that focuses on your empowered abilities. The possibilities really are endless now for this spec, and it will always be able to perform at the highest level because of this. Preservation and Augmentation can join forces to become a Chrono Warden. Gaining a buff tip the scales that increases your haste and cooldown recovery rate, decaying from 30%. This is a lot of fun to have a pseudo Bloodlust on a 2-minute cooldown, and for those that like the idea of support roles, during this cooldown they can also cause allies to echo their healing or damage. This spec also replaces their hover with warp, giving them access to a blink that can even reduce damage taken by 20% briefly. Somehow, Aug just got even tankier. And then the top spot, the best class going into the War Within, is looking like the Mage. Now I'm sure it's no shock to anyone, as the meme goes, the Mage is the favourite child of Blizzard's, and they just seem to keep doubling down on it. We had major reworks to the Mage during Dragonflight that gave this pure DPS class access to Mass Barrier, placing a huge shield on your whole party. I don't know how mages do it and keep getting away with stuff like this. It would make sense for a hybrid spec to be able to use such a strong ability to shield allies, but when you give this to a class that already has 3 very strong DPS specs, some of the best defensive capabilities in the game, as well as the best utility, it just becomes unfair. Mage being a pure DPS class means that you have 3 great shots at playing a spec that's considered very strong. They are all very well designed and can even excel in different encounters. Fire Mage has been blessed with another almost full rework, this time making it stronger and more fun than ever. Fire's AoE damage is now majorly based around Living Bomb, a favourite of mine and I'm sure many others. These Living Bombs are procced passively through your Fire Blast, and upon exploding will turn up to 3 more foes into Living Bombs, literally blowing everything up around you. During your Combustion cooldown, the damage of these bombs is greatly increased as well as your chance of applying them. Not only does this beef up one of the strongest cooldowns in the game, it also bridges the gap for Fire outside of its cooldowns, possibly Fire's biggest problem in recent expansions. This crazy amount of burst consistently means that you are no longer doing tank damage while waiting to get your Combustion back, so Fire is nowhere near as punishing as before. To aid this, we also get back into Combustion quicker with our Sun King's Blessing and Kindling talents, so all of this Combustion uptime means Fire is insanely mobile, rarely ever having to actually plant your feet in hard cast. On top of this mobility, they boast a cheat death in Cauterize, making them almost unkillable. So if you love high burst damage on the move, you really can't go wrong with this spec. Fire and Frost can merge into a Frostfire that gains access to Frostfire Bolt in place of their usual filler, and this can be empowered to explode for huge damage upon impact. With this spec, you'll also cool down spells from the opposing school of magic to nuke enemies with the Comet Storm whenever you press Meteor and vice versa, really beefing up your damage between cooldowns. Frost Mage is actually the only mage spec to not receive many changes going into the new expansion. Frost plays very much the same by consuming constant instant procs in empowered Ice Lances or Flurries that you shatter into your target for crazy high burst. Speaking of burst, Glacial Spike is still a core part of the rotation, impaling it into a frozen mob for some of the highest upfront damage in the game, and you can even split these Glacial Spikes and Ice Lances in 2 if splitting ice, making this spec one of the most dominant on 2-target cleave. You have incredible AoE burst with Frozen Orb and Comet Storm resets after pressing Cone of Cold, all while pelting enemies with instant cast blizzards. Frost is a really well-rounded spec in terms of damage, and when it comes to defensives, they are arguably the tankiest of the mage. Cold Snap resets the cooldown of your Ice Barrier, but most notably also your Ice Block, allowing you to be completely immune twice before waiting out the 4-minute cooldown. If you enjoy solo content, then the Frost Mage is probably your best bet. You can permanently slow your foes with chills or even freeze them in place while you bombard them with instant cast abilities as you keep your distance. Frost and Arcane can learn to be a spell slinger, conjuring splinters passively that embed themselves into the target, and upon reaching 8 stacks will summon a Splinter Storm, shattering all splinters for crazy burst and then firing another splinter for each splinter shattered. Easily the most fun part of this hero talent though is the Spellfrost teachings. This resets your Frozen Orb or fires out Arcane Orbs passively through your rotation while also increasing their damage. And last but definitely not least, in fact it is almost certainly first, we have the Arcane Mage. Now if you guys have been keeping up with my recent videos, you will know how much I am in love with this spec. I don't think I've ever enjoyed a class so much in WoW. Arcane, much like Fire, received quite a hefty talent rework coming into the War Within, which has made it better than ever, especially in terms of power. This spec has been dominating throughout beta, and even after the recent huge nerfs to Arcane Barrage, it still seems to stay on top. You're firing out these constant Arcane Barrages for insane cleave damage, while passively proccing Arcane Orbs to refill the charges you just spent on that barrage, so you can dump another barrage, which has another chance to proc another orb. The gameplay loop is just incredibly fun, and the damage is even better. Arcane Missiles can proc even more Arcane charges, and with Aether Attunement, these missiles fire at up to 5 targets, pretty much guaranteeing you a full Arcane charge bar. But even just the visuals alone are rewarding enough. This spec doesn't even need to be inside its cooldowns to be topping the damage meter, but when you cast Arcane Surge and pair it up with a touch of the Magi, you will erupt everything in violet magic, melting all enemies in sight, especially your priority target. Arcane is much simpler than before thanks to the rework, and is now pretty much fully mobile, especially in AoE due to all the instant casts and procs. So if it was the difficulty of Arcane that was putting you off, now is definitely the best time to try this spec out. Arcane and Fire can choose Sun Fury, conjuring Spellfire spheres that are consumed by your Arcane Phoenix when you pop your cooldowns, and these spheres allow the Phoenix to cast exceptional spells that deal exceptional damage. And once the Phoenix expires, you can fire off multiple barrages or Pyroblast back to back for free, really rounding out your cooldowns. Throughout your rotation, you'll also cool down bombardments of meteorites, which look absolutely incredible. But that's it, the best classes in the War Within right now, in my opinion. Let me know if you agree with my choices down in the comments below, and if not, tell me what you would have put on this list. If you did like the video, then please feel free to drop a like down below, subscribe to your boy, and until next time, I'll catch you guys later.